The slide didn't just freeze, it hemorrhaged. One moment, I was projecting the 5-year growth for Hayes Logistics. The next, a jagged crimson box swallowed the data access revoked by system administrator. A soft, collective exhale drifted from the board members, the sound of a lung collapsing. I pressed the clicker once, twice. The plastic groaned under my thumb, but the screen remained a digital crime scene. Then, the weight on my hip changed. My security badge, usually a warm hum of proximity sensors, gave a flat, mechanical chirp and went cold. Maribel, Julian. The CFO didn't look at me. He looked at the door. That's when I saw them. 2 security guardsmen I'd shared coffee with for 3 years, standing in the shadows of the glass partition. They didn't look like protectors anymore. They looked like bailiffs. There seems to be a server migration issue, I said. My voice was a lie, but it was a steady one. Professionalism is the last skin you strip before the bone shows. It's not the server. Maribel, Julian whispered. My personal phone buzzed in my blazer pocket. A sharp, rhythmic vibration that felt like a warning. I didn't have to look, but I did. Dad, you built your house on my land? Maribel. I'm just reclaiming the soil. Dinner at 8. Don't be late. The audacity of the metaphor made my throat tighten. He hadn't attended my wedding, hadn't called on my birthday, but he'd orchestrated a digital execution from 3 zip codes away. Ms. Hayes, the taller guard stepped forward, his hand hovering near his holster. We'll escort you to collect your personal effects, only the personal ones. The room. Once my sanctuary of steel and Lake Michigan views turned into a cage. I didn't beg. I didn't demand to see the paperwork. If you've spent your life being raised by a wolf, you know exactly when the hunt is over. I gathered my coat, my dignity tucked into the sharp line of my shoulders. As the elevator doors slid shut, cutting off the sight of my former life, I realized the terrifying truth. He didn't just want the company back. He wanted to see if I'd survive the crash. I stepped onto the Milwaukee sidewalk, the February wind slicing through my wool coat like a debt collector. I looked at the black screen of my phone. He wants a dinner, I thought, my pulse finally finding its rhythm. Fine. I hope he's hungry for what comes next. I sat in my car until the heater died, letting the Milwaukee frost creep across the windshield. In the gray light, the memory of 5 years ago didn't just surface, it bit. I remembered the blinds being drawn, that ritualistic confidentiality. My father sat at the head of the mahogany table, flanked by HR and legal like a high priest presiding over a sacrifice. They pushed a folder toward me. Inside was a meticulously crafted fiction phantom travel receipts, emails I hadn't sent, a timeline of misappropriated funds that looked terrifyingly real. I can make this go away, my father had whispered, his hand covering mine, but only if you go away first. Sign the resignation, Maribel. Let me protect you. I signed because I loved him. I signed because I believed a father was a fortress. He walked me to the elevator that day, his hand heavy on my shoulder, a weight I mistook for support. You'll thank me for this, he'd said. I had spent 5 years thanking him for a mercy he never actually showed. My phone vibrated, interrupting the ghost of his touch. It was a file from a former compliance analyst, a man who owed me a favor from the old days. No subject line, just a PDF of the original internal audit from that year. I scrolled, my breath hitching. In the digital margins, the tracked changes were still visible. Author A. Hayes, timestamp 2:00 a.m. He hadn't found the scandal. He had coded it. He didn't save my name. He hijacked my future and made me feel grateful for the theft. The protection he offered was just a velvet-lined cage. I put the car in gear. The dinner invitation was no longer a summons. It was a crime scene I was finally ready to investigate. He thinks he's inviting his daughter home for a lecture. He doesn't realize he's inviting the woman who just found the knife he left in her back. The call came before I could even clear the parking garage. Don't hang up, a voice rasped Marcus, a forensic accountant who had survived 3 of my father's purges. I just sent the encrypted link. Open it. Maribel. Now. I pulled into a red zone. my heart hammering against my ribs. I bypassed the security layers and opened the cap table for my own company, Riverfront Group. I knew every decimal point of my firm. I had bled for it. But as I scrolled, the rows began to shift, revealing hidden shell layers I'd never seen before. Look at the equity block under Lakeside Holdings, Marcus whispered. I did. My breath hitched. Beneath the clean corporate font was a ghost, a subsidiary of a subsidiary. Buried so deep it took a specialist to dig it out. 40%. That's impossible, I said, the words tasting like copper. I vetted every investor. I handpicked my board. You picked the face, Marcus countered. But your father provided the mask. He's been your lead investor since the Series B. He didn't just watch you build your empire. Maribel. He financed the bricks so he could own the foundation. I stared at the dashboard. Every late night, every cold Milwaukee morning I'd spent reviving abandoned warehouses, it hadn't been an escape. It had been an extension of his portfolio. I wasn't the CEO who broke free. I was a high-performing asset he'd allowed to grow until it was time to harvest. Why now, I asked. My voice dangerously low. Because his flagship is hemorrhaging cash. He's underwater on the new acquisition. And the board is looking for a scalp. He's not just taking his company back, Maribel. He's planning to fold yours into his to hide the debt. You aren't being fired. You're being absorbed. I closed the phone. The engine hummed a low, predatory growl. He didn't just want me back in the family fold. He wanted to use my success to bury his failure. He didn't want a daughter. He wanted a life raft. I looked at the dinner invite on my screen. I wasn't going there to beg for my job. I was going there to inform him that his life raft was about to develop a very calculated leak. The boardroom felt like a wake, but the body was still breathing. I sat at the mahogany table, facing a row of directors whose faces were as cold as the Lake Michigan fog. At the head of the table sat an empty chair, my father's chair, its leather still warm. His nameplate turned face down like a tombstone. Julian. The CFO slid a tablet toward me. The ledger was a disaster disguised as a spreadsheet. Your father authorized the over-leveraging, he said, his voice stripped of its usual warmth. He crossed a line we can't uncross. I scanned the figures. It wasn't just debt, it was fraud. A collapsed acquisition hidden behind a veil of creative accounting. And you all let him, I countered, my eyes locking onto his. You were the architects. He was just the signature. The woman to his left, the head of legal, didn't flinch. We were misled, but the regulators won't care about the who as much as the how. We need to stabilize the ship. Maribel, we need clean equity to absorb the rot. My equity, I said. It wasn't a question. Your company, Riverfront Group, is the only untainted asset left. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a predatory whisper. If we merge, the debt is diluted. The scandal vanishes. If we don't, the SEC comes for the Hayes name. Your father goes to prison, and you go down as his accomplice. The trap was perfect. I wasn't being invited back to the family business. I was being shoved into the furnace to keep the engine running. He'll ask you to sign the merger at dinner tonight, Julian said, standing up. If you refuse, we turn the files over to the authorities tomorrow morning. This can be a quiet transition, or it can be an execution. Choose. I stood, my pulse a steady, rhythmic thrum of cold fury. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I was the sacrifice. They forgot that I was the only one in the room who knew how to build something from nothing. I'll see him at dinner, I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. But tell him to bring a longer pen. He's going to need it. The restaurant was a cathedral of hushed voices and expensive silver. But our table felt like an interrogation room. My father didn't order wine. He didn't even open the menu. He sat with his hands flat on the white linen, his skin looking like parchment under the amber light. It's over. Maribel, he said, his voice a gravelly whisper. The board has the knives out. If you don't sign the merger tonight, they'll liquidate Hayes Logistics and drag Riverfront into the grave with it. You mean they'll drag you to prison? I said, my voice cutting through the ambient clinking of glass. He didn't flinch, which was worse. I made mistakes, but I did it to keep the legacy alive. For you. The lie was so practiced it almost sounded like a prayer. He slid a leather-bound folder across the table. The merger agreement. The death warrant for the company I'd built with my own sweat and sleepless nights. Sign this, he urged, leaning in. We consolidate the assets. The debt gets buried in the transition. We walk away clean. Father and daughter. I looked at him, really looked at him. I saw the man who had erased my career 5 years ago and the man who was trying to steal my future now. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was a scavenger. And if I don't, then the SEC gets the files at 8 o'clock a.m. I go down. And I've made sure the paper trail leads directly to your office door. Don't be a martyr for a pile of bricks. Maribel. I picked up the pen. My pen, a heavy, custom-weighted fountain pen I'd bought when I closed my first $1 million deal. I felt the familiar click of the digital recorder I'd had installed in its barrel. Fine, I said, my voice trembling with a fake fragility that I knew he would feast on. Tonight, we end this. I signed. The ink was black and permanent. He exhaled. A sound of pure, selfish relief, and reached for the folder like a starving man reaching for bread. You did the right thing, he said, his ego already reinflating. I did the only thing left to do, I replied, standing up. I left him there with his stolen victory. As I stepped into the biting Milwaukee wind, I pulled the pen from my pocket and stopped the recording. He thought he'd just saved his empire. He didn't realize he'd just given me a confession, a signature, and 45 minutes of evidence that would change the rules of his game forever. I didn't play the file until I was home, the silence of my apartment magnifying the frantic thrum of my pulse. I stripped off my blazer, feeling the phantom weight of his hand on my shoulder, and pressed play. The audio was crisp. It wasn't the dinner conversation. It was the pre-game, the recording my pen had captured when I'd accidentally left it in the boardroom an hour before our meal. She's sentimental. My father's voice rang out, stripped of its paternal warmth. He was talking to Julian. I'll play the family legacy card. She'll bleed for the name. And while she's bandaging herself, she'll sign the merger. And if she looks too closely at the debt ratios, Julian asked. She won't. I've spent 30 years training her to look for my approval instead of the fine print. Once the assets transfer, we let the subsidiary fail. Maribel takes the reputational hit. The board gets its liquidity, and I retire a hero. I sat in the dark, the words echoing like a death sentence. He hadn't just lied to me. He had weaponized my love for him. He viewed my loyalty as a structural weakness he could exploit to shore up his own crumbling ego. I played the clip again, training her to look for my approval. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. I hadn't been his daughter. I had been his long-term investment. Every mercy he'd shown, every time he'd protected me, it was just maintenance on a tool he intended to use later. My phone buzzed. A text from the board's legal counsel. The documents are being processed. Welcome home. Maribel. I didn't cry. The heat in my chest had long since turned into a cold. Clinical clarity. I opened my laptop and began drafting a very different set of documents. If he wanted to use me as a shield, he was about to find out that a shield can also be a blade. I'm not looking for your approval anymore. Dad, I whispered to the empty room. I'm looking for your seat. I filed the preliminary injunction at 6 a.m. It was a weak, frantic-looking document, exactly what a too emotional woman would file when backed into a corner. By noon, the Milwaukee legal circles were whispering that Maribel Hayes had finally lost her nerve. My father called at 12:15. His voice was smooth, draped in that paternal condescension I had once mistaken for love. Withdraw the motion. Maribel, you're embarrassing the name. It's a messy amateur play. Even your own lead counsel is distancing himself. Maybe I'm just tired of playing by your rules, I said, my voice intentionally thin. Tired makes you sloppy. He sighed. Just let it go. We'll see you at the signing tomorrow. I hung up and watched my allies vanish. My CFO stopped returning texts. My primary investor issued a no comment to the press. In the eyes of the city, I was a falling star. I spent the afternoon in the courthouse hallway, letting the board's lawyers see me looking pale, clutching a coffee cup like a life raft. I let them see me fail. What they didn't see was the secondary filing, the one submitted under a sealed whistleblower provision in a different jurisdiction, while they were busy laughing at my sloppy injunction. They were ignoring the fact that I had just triggered a mandatory debt audit clause hidden in the fine print of the merger they were so eager to sign. Failure is the best camouflage. They were so busy watching me drown that they didn't notice I was the one who had opened the floodgates. My phone buzzed. A private message from Marcus. They bought the act. The board just authorized the final transfer. They think they've won. I straightened my blazer and wiped the faux despair from my face. Good, I whispered to the empty hallway. Let them celebrate. It's easier to hit a target when it's standing still to cheer. The applause was polite, the kind reserved for successful burials. My father stood at the head of the table. His chest expanded, radiating the smug aura of a man who had just stolen a life raft and called it leadership. The merger is officially ratified, the chairman announced. Glasses of expensive scotch appeared as if by magic. Wait, I said. The word wasn't loud, but it had a frequency that cut through the celebration like a glass shard. My father turned, his smile patronizing. Maribel, the ceremony's over. You can celebrate later. I'm not celebrating, I said, sliding a thick, crimson-bound folder to the center of the table. I'm exercising my rights by signing those papers. This board just legally transferred all of Hayes Logistics' primary debt, the toxic debt you were trying to hide, into the jurisdiction of the creditor. Julian scoffed. We know that, Maribel. It's a standard debt follow asset clause. Correct, I replied, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. But you didn't check the morning's trade notifications. Yesterday, an offshore entity called MH Capital bought that debt at 40 cents on the dollar. Since the merger is now finalized, MH's Capital is the primary secured creditor of this entire corporation. The chairman's glass hit the table with a dull thud. And who represents MA and Capital? I let the silence sit, heavy and suffocating. Before I looked my father dead in the eye, I do. I am the sole owner. And as your lead creditor, I'm declaring a technical default based on the fraud I recorded in this room 48 hours ago. The color drained from my father's face, leaving him looking gray and ancient. The room didn't just go quiet. It went extinct. He had spent 30 years teaching me that the person who holds the paper holds the power. He just never expected me to buy the paper he used to hang me. You can't do this, he whispered, his hands trembling on the mahogany. This is family. No, I said, standing up and smoothing my blazer. This is business. And as of 5 minutes ago, you're evicted. I didn't wait for the lawyers to scream. I walked out of the room. The sound of my heels on the marble floor, the only rhythm that mattered. The king was still on his throne, but I had just dismantled the castle around him. The boardroom didn't explode, it evaporated, one by one. The directors I'd just decapitated gathered their belongings with the hushed, frantic urgency of people fleeing a burning building. They didn't look at me. To them, I was no longer a daughter or a colleague. I was the storm that had just made them irrelevant. We need to discuss the interim leadership, Julian stammered, his hand shaking as he reached for his briefcase. There is no interim, I said, my voice echoing in the sudden cavern of the room. The new board is already being briefed in the lobby. You're excused. Then there was only him. My father sat at the far end of the table, his empire reduced to a stack of voided contracts. He looked small. For the first time in 34 years, the shadow he cast didn't reach me. I walked toward him, the sound of my heels rhythmic and final. I reached out my hand. He stared at it for a moment, confused, before realizing what I wanted. He fumbled with the lanyard around his neck, the plastic clicking against his buttons. He handed me his access badge, the key to the kingdom. I walked to the wall-mounted scanner and swiped his card. A sharp, mechanical chirp echoed through the room, followed by the jagged red text, "Access revoked." Is that it? He asked, his voice thin and papery. After 30 years, I just disappear. You didn't disappear. Dad, you were liquidated. I said. I slid a plain white envelope across the mahogany. Your severance. It's the legal minimum. Don't call me to negotiate. I'm the one who wrote the policy now. He didn't open the envelope. He just looked at the badge in my hand, the same piece of plastic that had locked me out of my life weeks ago. I did it for the legacy, he whispered. A ghost clinging to a lie. The legacy is a ledger, and it's finally balanced. I replied. I watched him walk toward the door. He paused at the threshold, waiting for me to say something, a goodbye. A curse? A shred of recognition? I gave him nothing but silence. When the door finally clicked shut, I realized that the man I had feared my entire life wasn't a titan. He was just a man who had run out of other people's money. I turned to the window. Below, Milwaukee was turning on its lights. I wasn't happy. I wasn't sad. I was simply, for the first time, the only person holding the keys. I signed the final order standing up. The pen felt lighter than it ever had. The room was different now, stripped of the ego that had fueled it for decades. The representative from the employee-owned trust took the folder from me with a nod of profound respect. The transition is complete, she said. The workers own the majority share now. They'll elect a board that actually knows how the machines run. Good, I said, looking out at the Milwaukee skyline. Make sure the anti-takeover clauses are ironclad. I don't want another man like my father ever finding a way back in. I didn't stay for the press release. I didn't want the applause of a city that only respects you when you're holding a scepter. I walked to my old office, packed my few personal belongings into a single bag, and left the keys on the desk. As I walked through the lobby, my phone buzzed. A voicemail from my father. I didn't listen to it. I deleted it. Some silences are meant to be permanent. I drove back to Riverfront Group, my company, the one I had built with clean hands. When I walked through the doors, the air tasted different. There was no fear here, no hidden agendas. My team looked up, saw my face, and understood. No speeches were needed. We have a 9:00 a.m. on the new warehouse project, Marcus said, handing me a coffee. You in, I'm in, I said, sitting at my own desk. I realized then that I hadn't won by taking my father's throne. I had won by realizing the throne was a trap. He had spent his life guarding a kingdom of shadows, while I had built a home out of light. Winning isn't about standing on top of the pile. It's about being the one who decides when the game is over. I had changed the rules, broken the cycle, and finally, for the first time in my life, I was answering to no one but myself.